Dear Elena Vasquez had spent 3 years on Kellis 4, and she had learned one truth above all others. This planet wanted everything dead. The jungle stretched across continents like a living thing, breathing and hungry and patient, and every creature within it had evolved for one purpose only, which was to kill or to avoid being killed, and humans were neither good at killing nor good at avoiding death. So they stayed inside their research stations and watched from orbit and wrote reports that nobody back on Earth would ever read. Elena was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien life, and Kellis 4 had more alien life than any world humanity had ever found. But the most fascinating and the most terrifying of all were the Vethkai. They stood 3 meters tall when fully grown, and their bodies were covered in scales that looked like black glass, and they had 6 eyes, arranged in a crown around their skulls so that nothing could ever sneak up on them. And their claws could tear through steel plating like paper. And their teeth were designed for one thing only. They were apex predators, the top of a food chain that had no mercy in it anywhere. And the Galactic Survey Corps had marked Kellis 4 as observation only, which meant no contact and no interference and absolutely no going outside without armed escort. Elena followed the rules because she was not stupid, and stupid people did not survive on death worlds, and she had every intention of surviving long enough to go home and see her mother again and eat food that did not come from a protein synthesizer. But then the geothermal vents erupted. She was in the monitoring station when the alarms started screaming, and the orbital feeds showed Sector 7 lighting up like a sun being born. And she watched the data scroll across her screen as underground pressure that had been building for 10,000 years finally released itself in a cascade of blue-white fire that burst through the jungle floor. The flames moved faster than anything should move, faster than the wind, faster than thought, and they consumed everything they touched and turned ancient trees into ash in seconds. And Elena watched the destruction spread across the sector like a disease. And then she saw them. The feed from Drone 7 Alpha was still active, hovering above a small clearing where the fire had not yet reached. And in that clearing, Elena saw a Vethkai mother lying on the ground with her body twisted at a wrong angle because the ridge beneath her had collapsed when the vents opened. She was dying. Elena could see that much, and she was not dying from fire but from the fall. And her scales were cracked along her spine where the rocks had broken her. But that was not what made Elena stop breathing. Pressed against the dying mother were 3 cubs, and they were small, barely the size of wolves, and their scales had not yet hardened into armor, and their eyes were wide with a fear that needed no translation because fear looked the same on every world. The mother was trying to push them away, trying to make them run, but they would not leave her because she was their mother, and they did not understand that staying meant death. Elena watched the firewall approaching on the secondary feed, and she did the math in her head, and she knew that the cubs had maybe 10 minutes before the flames reached that clearing. And she knew that they would not leave their mother. And she knew that no rescue team could reach them in time because the station was 40 kilometers away and the drop pods were designed for emergencies. Only she stood up from her console and her hands were shaking, but her mind was very clear and very calm in the way that minds become when there is only one choice left to make. Vasquez, "What are you doing?" said Mission Commander Chun. And his voice was sharp because he had seen her face and he knew that look. "There are cubs in Sector 7, Elena said. And her voice did not shake even though her hands did. 3 of them, and their mother is dying. And the fire will reach them in less than 10 minutes. That is unfortunate," Chun said. And his voice was carefully flat. "The protocol is clear. And we do not interfere with native species. And we especially do not risk human lives for predators that would eat US, if given the chance. They are children. They are HFY juveniles. And in 2 years, they will be 3 meters tall and capable of killing a dozen humans. And the protocol exists for good reasons, Vasquez. Elena looked at the screen where the cubs were still pressed against their mother, and the fire was still coming, and the mother was still trying to push them away. With the last of her strength, I know the protocol, Elena said, and then she walked out of the monitoring station and down the corridor to the emergency bay where the drop pods waited in their cradles. Like metal seeds ready to be planted, she heard Chun shouting behind her, and she heard the alarms change pitch as someone triggered the lockdown. But she had already entered her authorization code, and the pod door was already opening, and she was already inside before anyone could stop her. The pod was small and cramped and smelled like recycled air and emergency rations. And Elena strapped herself in and entered the coordinates and felt the launch system engage beneath her. Vasquez, this is a direct order. Chun's voice came through the pod speaker. Abort the launch and return to the station immediately. Do you understand me? Elena looked at the small screen showing the feed from Drone 7 Alpha, showing 3 cubs and a dying mother, and a wall of fire that was now 8 minutes away. I understand, she said, and then she launched. The pod screamed through the atmosphere and the heat shields glowed orange, and Elena felt her bones trying to rearrange themselves as the G-forces pressed her into the seat. And she thought about her mother back on Earth, and she thought about the protein synthesizer food she would never eat again, and she thought about the 3 cubs who did not know that a strange, soft creature was falling from the sky to save them. The jungle rushed up to meet her, and the pod's retro thrusters fired, and she hit the ground hard enough to rattle her teeth. And then the door blew open, and the heat hit her like a physical wall, and she realized that she had just entered hell, but the cubs were only 200 meters away, and she could hear them crying in sounds that her translator could not process. And the fire was now 6 minutes away, and Elena started running. Elena ran through the dying jungle, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the temperature was climbing towards something her suit was not designed to handle. And warning lights were flashing across her visor, telling her things she already knew, which was that she was going to die here if she did not turn back immediately. She did not turn back. The clearing was just ahead, and she could hear the cubs now, their cries cutting through the roar of the approaching flames. And she pushed through a wall of burning vegetation and stumbled into the open space where the HFY mother lay broken on the ground. The cubs saw her first. They were huddled against their mother's body, and their 6 eyes went wide when Elena emerged from the smoke. And the largest one let out a sound that was half snarl and half scream, a warning that said stay away in any language. Elena stopped moving and raised her hands slowly, because she knew that sudden movements meant death when dealing with predators, even young ones, even terrified ones. I am not here to hurt you, she said. And she knew they could not understand her words, but she hoped they could understand her voice. The softness of it, the lack of threat. The mother HFY was still alive, but barely, and her 6 eyes focused on Elena with an intelligence that made Elena's heart ache. Because this creature knew she was dying, and she knew her cubs were going to die with her, and there was nothing she could do. Elena took a slow step forward, and the largest cub snarled again, but did not attack. I know, Elena said. I know you are scared. I know I smell wrong and look wrong, and everything about me is wrong. But I am trying to help. She took another step and another, and the cubs pressed harder against their mother, but they did not run, and they did not attack. And Elena realized they were too exhausted and too afraid to do anything except wait for death. The mother made a sound then, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. And Elena did not need a translator to understand what she was saying. "Take them, please take them." Elena knelt beside the dying predator, and she looked into those 6 eyes, and she made a promise without words. A promise that crossed the gulf between species and evolution and millions of years of separate development. "I will protect them." The mother's eyes closed and her breathing stopped, and the cubs began to keen in a high pitch that hurt Elena's ears. And Elena wanted to give them time to grieve, but the fire was coming, and time was the one thing none of them had. She looked up and saw the wall of flame through the trees, and it was closer than she had calculated. Maybe 3 minutes away now, and she could feel the heat intensifying with every second. Elena pulled the emergency thermal blanket from her pack, a thin sheet of reflective material designed to protect against extreme temperatures for short periods. And she knew it was not enough, but it was all she had. "We need to move," she said to the cubs. "We need to move right now." But they would not move. They would not leave their mother. And Elena understood, because she would not leave her mother either. Not even if the world was ending. The fire was 2 minutes away. Elena made a decision that was not really a decision at all, because there was only one thing she could do. She spread the thermal blanket as wide as it would go, and she positioned herself between the cubs and the approaching flames, and she planted her feet in the ash-covered ground, and she waited. The largest cub stopped keening and looked at her with something like confusion, because this small soft creature was doing something that made no sense, standing in front of fire as if she could stop it, as if her tiny body could hold back the destruction of an entire world. The heat was unbearable now, and Elena could feel her suit beginning to fail, the outer layer melting in patches, and she could smell her own hair starting to singe beneath her helmet. 1 minute. The fire was a living wall of blue and white and orange, and it roared like a beast, and Elena stared into it without blinking, because she refused to look away from the thing that was about to kill her. 30 seconds. She thought about her mother, and she thought about Earth, and she thought about all the things she would never do and all the places she would never see. And she felt sad, but she did not feel afraid, because she had made her choice, and it was the right choice. The fire hit. The thermal blanket caught this first wave and reflected it away, but the heat that got through was enough to drive Elena to her knees. And she screamed, but she did not move. She held the blanket up even as her arms shook and her muscles burned. 10 seconds became 20, became 30, and Elena realized she was still alive. The fire was parting around them, deflected by a rocky outcrop she had not noticed, channeled away from the clearing by the geography of the land. And the thermal blanket was doing just enough to protect them from the radiant heat that spilled over. She had not planned this. She had not known about the rocks. She had simply stood in front of children and refused to move, and somehow the universe had decided that was enough. The main wave passed, and the flames continued on toward the east, leaving behind a landscape of black and gray and death. But the clearing was intact, and the cubs were alive, and Elena was alive, though her suit was ruined and her skin was blistered in a dozen places. She collapsed onto her back and stared at the sky through the smoke, and she laughed, because laughing was the only response that made sense. The smallest cub crept toward her, moving slowly, its 6 eyes fixed on her face. And when it reached her, it made a sound she had never heard before, a soft chirping noise that vibrated in her chest. Elena reached out with a shaking hand and touched its snout, and the cub did not bite her. "We made it," she whispered, but she knew they were not safe yet, because the fire was still burning all around them, and they were alone in the middle of a dead zone with no way to call for help. She sat up slowly and looked at the 3 cubs who were now watching her with something other than fear. And she looked at the mother, who lay still and silent behind them. and she looked at the burning world that surrounded them on all sides. "Okay," she said. "We need to find water, and we need to find shelter, and we need to walk until we reach somewhere safe." The cubs did not understand her words, but they understood when she started walking, and they followed her, because she was the only thing left to follow. Elena led them into the burned jungle, and she did not know where she was going, and she did not know if they would survive, and she did not know what would happen if they did. But she walked anyway, because that was what humans did when everything else failed. They kept walking. The first day was the hardest because Elena did not know if they would survive the night. Her suit was damaged beyond repair, and her water supply was limited to what she had brought in the emergency pack, which was enough for maybe 3 days if she rationed carefully. And her food consisted of protein bars that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. The cubs followed her through the burned landscape, and they did not try to run away, and they did not try to attack her. And Elena supposed that was the best she could hope for under the circumstances. She had started calling them names in her head because it helped her think of them as individuals rather than as predators who might eat her if they got hungry enough. The largest one she called Shadow because it moved like darkness given form, silent and watchful and always aware of everything around them. The middle one she called Storm because it had a pattern of lighter scales across its face that looked like lightning frozen in glass. The smallest one she called Echo because it made soft sounds that bounced off the dead trees and came back changed. And because it was the one that stayed closest to her, the one that seemed to trust her the most. On the second day, they found water. It was a stream that had survived the fire by running through a rocky channel. And the water was warm and tasted like ash, but it was drinkable. And Elena filled her containers while the cubs waded into the shallows and drank deeply. She watched them drink, and she realized how young they really were, how dependent on their mother they had been. And she felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. These were not pets, and they were not children in the human sense. But they were young, and they were alone, and they needed someone to protect them until they were old enough to protect themselves. Elena decided she would be that someone. On the third day, her food ran out. She had rationed protein bars as carefully as she could, but there were 4 mouths to feed, and the cubs were growing creatures with fast metabolisms. And she had given them most of her supplies because they needed the calories more than she did. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she kept walking. Shadow caught something on the 4th day. A small creature that looked like a lizard crossed with a spider. And Elena watched as the cubs tore into it with their sharp teeth, and she felt her own hunger turn into something darker and more desperate. Shadow looked up at her with blood on its snout, and it made a sound she had not heard before. And then it picked up a piece of the creature and brought it to her. Elena stared at the offering, and she understood what it meant. Shadow was sharing food with her, the way cubs shared food with pack members, the way family shared food with family. And this was not just survival anymore. This was something else entirely. She took the piece of meat, and she pretended to eat it because she did not think her human stomach could handle raw alien flesh. But she made the sounds of appreciation that she had heard the cubs make when they ate. And Shadow seemed satisfied that night. They slept together in a hollow beneath a fallen tree, and the cubs pressed against her for warmth, and Elena listened to their breathing. And she felt something shift inside her chest. She had come here to save them, but somewhere along the way they had started saving her too. The 5th day brought danger. They were crossing a section of jungle that had not burned completely when Elena heard a sound that made her blood freeze. A deep rumbling growl that came from somewhere in the shadows ahead. The cubs heard it too, and they pressed against her legs. And their own growls were high and thin. And afraid Elena knew what was making that sound. Adult Vethkai, one of them stepped out of the undergrowth, and it was massive, easily 3 times the size of the cubs. And its scales were scarred from 100 battles, and its 6 eyes fixed on Elena with a hunger that needed no translation. She was prey, and it was predator, and the cubs were either food or competition. And either way this encounter was gonna end in blood. Elena did not run. She stepped forward and put herself between the adult and the cubs, and she raised her arms and she screamed at the top of her lungs. A sound that was not words, but was pure defiance. Pure refusal to accept death without a fight. The adult Vethkai paused. It looked at her with something like confusion, because prey did not act this way. Prey ran and hid and died. Prey did not stand in front of predators and scream. Elena kept screaming, and she grabbed a rock from the ground, and she threw it at the creature, and she picked up another rock and threw that too. And her throws were weak and pathetic. But they were something. The adult made a sound that might have been laughter, and it took a step forward, and then Shadow stepped up beside Elena. The cub was small and young and no match for an adult. But it stood beside her anyway, and it added its voice to hers. A snarl that was too high to be threatening, but was full of conviction. Storm joined them. Then echo 4 voices against 1. 3 young predators and 1 small human standing together against something that could kill them all without effort. The adult Vethkai stopped. It looked at them for a long moment with those 6 unreadable eyes. And then it made a sound that Elena's translator struggled with. Something that might have been respect, or might have been acknowledgement, or might have been something else entirely. And then it turned and walked away. Elena's legs gave out and she sat down hard in the dirt, and the cubs gathered around her, and she laughed and cried at the same time because they were still alive, impossibly alive. And she did not understand why, but she was grateful. They walked for 6 more days. Elena's body was failing, weakened by hunger and dehydration and the burns that had never properly healed. And she had to lean on Shadow sometimes just to keep moving. And the cubs had started hunting for her as well as themselves, because they understood that their soft packmate could not hunt for herself. On the 11th day, Elena saw something through the trees that made her heart stop. It was a ship, a Galactic Survey Corps vessel had landed in a clearing ahead, and there were soldiers moving around it with weapons drawn and scanners active. Elena wanted to run toward them, but her legs would not cooperate, so she walked as fast as she could, and she called out in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, because her throat was too dry for anything louder. The soldiers saw her, and their weapons came up, and then they saw what was behind her, and their weapons came up higher. "Do not shoot," Elena said. "They are with me. They are not a threat. Please do not shoot." The captain of the vessel was a Morvith, a 4-armed alien with gray skin and no patience in its expression. And it looked at Elena like she was something it had found on the bottom of its foot. "Dr. Vasquez," the captain said, "you have violated approximately 17 protocols and caused an interstellar incident, and I have been ordered to bring you back to face a tribunal." Elena nodded because she had expected this. "I understand," she said. "What I do not understand," the captain continued, "is why 3 juvenile Vethkai are following you like lost puppies." Elena looked back at Shadow and Storm and Echo, at the 3 cubs who had walked beside her through fire and hunger and danger, who had shared their food with her and protected her and trusted her when every instinct should have told them to do otherwise. "Because," she said, "I am their mother now." The tribunal was held in a room with white walls and cold lighting and faces that looked at Elena like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Elena stood before them in a clean uniform that felt wrong against her skin after 11 days in the jungle. And her burns had been treated, but they still hurt. And her body was weak from hunger, but her spine was straight because she refused to show weakness to people. who had never had to make the choice she made. The council consisted of 7 members from 7 different species, representatives of the Galactic Survey Corps and its Oversight Committee, and they had been talking for 3 hours about protocols and procedures and the proper response to emergency situations. Elena had stopped listening after the first hour. She was thinking about Shadow and Storm and Echo, locked in a containment facility somewhere on the other side of the station, probably scared and confused and wondering why their packmate had abandoned them. Dr. Vasquez, the council chair said, and Elena snapped her attention back to the room. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Elena looked at the 7 faces looking back at her, and she thought about all the things she could say, all the arguments she could make about compassion and moral duty and the definition of personhood. But in the end, she only said one thing. They were children. They were Vethkai juveniles, another council member said. Apex predators from a Class 7 death world. And in 2 years, they will be capable of killing a dozen humans without effort. I know what they will become, Elena said. I knew it when I launched. I knew it when I stood in front of the fire. I knew it every day of those 11 days in the jungle. And it does not matter. It does not matter that you risked your life and violated every protocol to save creatures that would happily eat you if they were old enough. No, Elena said. It does not matter because they were children and they were going to die and I could stop it. And that is all that matters. That is all that has ever mattered. The council chair opened his mouth to respond, but he was interrupted by a sound from outside the room. A deep rumbling that vibrated through the walls and made the lights flicker. Then the alarm started. Elena knew that sound. She knew it in her bones after 11 days of hearing it from 3 small throats. And she felt her heart stop because that sound was not coming from 3 small throats anymore. What is happening? The council chair demanded. A soldier burst through the door with panic on his face. Sir, we have a situation. The Vethkai. They are here. Dozens of them. They have surrounded the station. Elena pushed past the soldier and ran through the corridors toward the main observation deck. Ignoring the shouts behind her, ignoring the pain in her body, ignoring everything except the need to see what was happening, she reached the observation deck and she looked out the window and she stopped breathing. The jungle around the research station was full of Vethkai. Not dozens but hundreds, emerging from the trees like shadows given form, their black scales gleaming in the sunlight, their 6 eyes fixed on the station with an intensity that made Elena's knees weak. They were not attacking. They were waiting. Dr. Vasquez, a voice said behind her. And Elena turned to see Captain Chun standing in the doorway with a weapon in his hands and fear in his eyes. What did you do? I do not know, Elena said. Honestly, the Vethkai parted and a figure walked through them. Larger than the others, older, its scales scarred with age and battle. And it walked with the confidence of something that had never known fear in its entire existence. The patriarch Elena had read about Vethkai, patriarchs in the research files, the eldest of each region who led through strength and wisdom. And this one was ancient, possibly centuries old. And it was walking directly toward the station. We need to evacuate, Chun said. We need to get everyone off this planet now. No, Elena said. And she did not know why she said it, but she knew it was true. They are not here to attack. How can you possibly know that? Elena looked at the patriarch approaching the station, and she remembered Shadow and Storm and Echo standing beside her against an adult Vethkai. And she remembered the sound that adult had made before walking away. Because if they wanted us dead, she said, we would already be dead. She walked toward the door. Vasquez, where are you going? To meet them. That is insane. Elena stopped and turned back to look at Chun. Everything I have done on this planet has been insane. And I'm still alive, and those cubs are still alive. So maybe insanity is not the worst approach. She walked out of the station and into the open space between the buildings and the jungle. And she felt the eyes of hundreds of Vethkai on her. And she felt her heart pounding so hard it hurt. But she kept walking. The patriarch met her in the middle up close. It was even more massive than she had realized. Twice her height and probably 10 times her weight. And its 6 eyes looked down at her with an intelligence that she could feel like pressure against her mind. "You are the one," the patriarch said. And its voice was deep and resonant, and its translator gave the words a strange musical quality. "The soft one who burned." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. "Our young ones sent scent songs across the jungle," the patriarch continued. "Stories of what you did, how you stood against the fire, how you walked with them through the burned lands, how you screamed at one of our hunters to protect them. I did what anyone would do," Elena said. The patriarch made a sound that might have been laughter. "No, you did not. No creature does what you did. Not for young ones that are not their own. Not for young ones of another species entirely. They were children." "Yes," the patriarch said. "They were, and you chose to be their mother when their true mother could not. You chose to stand between them and death when you had no reason to do so. I had a reason." "What reason?" Elena looked up at the ancient predator, and she thought about the question. Really thought about it. And the answer she found was simpler than she expected. "Because I could not live with myself if I did not try." The patriarch was silent for a long moment, its 6 eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she did not look away because she had stood in front of fire, and she could stand in front of this. "In our culture," the patriarch said finally, "parenthood is not about blood. It is not about biology. It is about the choice to stand between a child and death. About the choice to give everything for those who cannot protect themselves. I understand. Do you?" The patriarch lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with hers. "You have made that choice 3 times for children who were not yours. And in doing so, you have become something sacred to us." Elena felt tears on her face, but she did not wipe them away. "The cubs you saved have been calling for you," the patriarch said. "They have been sending distress cries that every Vethkai on this continent can hear, calling for their mother. And we came to see what kind of creature could make our children cry like that." "I am sorry," Elena said. "I did not mean to cause trouble. You misunderstand," the patriarch said. "We did not come to stop their cries. We came to honor the one who earned them." The patriarch rose to its full height and let out a sound that shook the air. A roaring call that was taken up by every Vethkai surrounding the station. Hundreds of voices joined together in something that was not a threat. It was welcome. "You are small," the patriarch said when the sound faded. "You are weak. You have no claws, no scales, no venom. You should have died 100 times in our jungle." "I know," Elena said. "And yet here you stand. Mother of 3, honored by predators." The patriarch turned and made a gesture. And from the edge of the jungle, 3 figures came running. 3 cubs who had grown noticeably in just a few days since Elena had last seen them. And they ran past the adult Vethkai and crashed into Elena with enough force to knock her off her feet. She lay on the ground with shadow and storm and echo pressing against her, their rumbling purrs vibrating through her entire body. And she laughed, because laughing was the only response that made sense. The patriarch looked down at her with something in its eyes that might have been amusement. "Take good care of them. Soft one," it said. "The jungle will be watching." And Elena knew that her life had changed forever. 50 years had passed since the day Elena Vasquez stood between 3 orphan cubs and a wall of fire. And the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Vethkai Dominion controlled 73 star systems across the outer rim, an empire built by the deadliest predators the galaxy had ever known. and every species in the known universe knew to fear them, every species except one. The diplomatic vessel from Earth entered Vethkai, space with its shields down and its weapons offline because the humans aboard knew something that the rest of the galaxy did not understand. Something that had been true for 50 years. The Vethkai did not hunt humans. Ambassador James Chum stood at the viewport of the ship and watched the Vethkai homeworld grow larger. A planet of endless jungles and towering mountains and predators that could tear him apart without effort. And he felt no fear. His grandmother had told him stories when he was young. Stories about a woman who had stood in front of fire, who had walked through hell with 3 alien cubs, who had changed the relationship between 2 species through nothing more than stubborn refusal to let children die. He had grown up on those stories, and now he was here to see the legacy of them with his own eyes. The ship landed in the capital city, a sprawling complex of structures that had been grown rather than built. Living architecture that twisted toward the sky like frozen flames. And James stepped out onto alien soil and breathed alien air and looked up at the Vethkai, who had gathered to meet them. They were massive, 3 meters tall and covered in scales like black glass. And their 6 eyes studied the human delegation with an intensity that would have terrified anyone who did not know the history. James knew the history. Ambassador Chun, a deep voice said, and the Vethkai stepped forward from the crowd. A female with silver patterns across her scales and eyes that held an intelligence that was almost human. I am Prime Hunter Shadowfang. Welcome to our world. James bowed in the human fashion and then lowered his head in the Vethkai fashion. Showing his throat in a gesture of trust had taken him months to learn. Prime Hunter, he said. I bring greetings from Earth and from the United Human Territories. We are honored by your welcome. Shadowfang made a sound that James's translator identified as pleasure. Come, there is something you must see before we begin our discussions. She led them through the city, past Vethkai, who stopped and stared at the humans with curiosity rather than hunger, past structures that hummed with energy and life, until they reached a plaza at the heart of the capital. James stopped walking. In the center of the plaza stood a statue, carved from the black stone that the Vethkai prized above all other materials. And the statue depicted a human woman. She was small and soft, and her arms were spread wide, and behind her was a wall of carved flame. And her face was lifted toward the sky with an expression of defiance that made James's throat tight. We call her the Mother Who Chose, Shadowfang said. Every cub on every world learns her story before they learn anything else. James walked closer to the statue, and he saw the inscription carved into the base. Symbols in the Vethkai language that his translator rendered as something that made his eyes burn. She stood in front of death for children who were not hers. She walked through fire for children who would have eaten her if they were older. She screamed at hunters and threw stones at predators and never stopped fighting. And when she was asked why she did these things, she said only that they were children, and that was enough. That was my grandmother's mentor, James said, and his voice was quiet because he did not trust it to be steady. Dr. Elena Vasquez, she died 12 years ago on Earth, surrounded by her family. We know, Shadowfang said. We felt it when she passed. The scent songs carried across the stars. Every Vethkai in the Dominion mourned her. James looked at the Prime Hunter. You mourned a human. We mourned our mother, Shadowfang said simply. She gestured, and 2 more Vethkai approached. One with storm patterns across its face, and one that was smaller than the others, with a voice that seemed to echo strangely. These are Storm and Echo, Shadowfang said. I am the one she called Shadow. We are the cubs she saved. We are the ones she raised. James stared at the 3 ancient Vethkai. These massive predators who had walked beside Elena through the burning jungle, who had learned from her what it meant to protect those who could not protect themselves. She spoke of you often, he said. She said you were her greatest adventure. Shadow made a sound that vibrated through James's chest. She was our greatest lesson. What lesson? That strength is not about claws or scales or size, Shadow said. Strength is about standing when you cannot stand, fighting when you cannot fight, choosing to protect others when every instinct tells you to run. Echo stepped forward. The humans have a word we did not understand when we first heard it. She used it often when she spoke of why she saved us. What word? James asked. Love. James felt the tears on his face, and he did not wipe them away, because he had learned from his grandmother that tears were not weakness. She taught us that love is not just an emotion. Echo continued. It is an action. It is the choice to put yourself between danger and those who cannot protect themselves. It is the willingness to burn for others. Storm spoke for the first time. Its voice like distant thunder. When we built our dominion, we built it on the principles she taught us. We protect the young of every species. We stand against those who would harm children. We choose to be mothers rather than just predators. Shadow looked at James with 6 ancient eyes that had seen 50 years of history unfold. Do you understand now why we do not hunt humans? Because of one woman? Because one woman showed us what your species is capable of, Shadow said. Small and soft and clawless, but willing to burn for children who are not your own. Willing to stand in front of fire with nothing but stubbornness and love. James looked at the statue of Elena Vasquez, frozen forever in the moment of her greatest choice. And he understood something that he had never fully grasped before humanity's place in the galaxy had been secured. Not by weapons or technology or military might, but by a single act of compassion from a woman who could not watch children die. The rest of the galaxy fears us, Storm said. They see our claws and our scales and our teeth and they run, but humans have never run from us. And we have never hunted them. Because of the treaty, James said. There is no treaty, Shadow said. And there was something like amusement in its voice. There has never been a treaty. We simply do not hunt humans because to do so would dishonor the memory of our mother. James felt the weight of that statement settle onto his shoulders. The understanding that humanity's safety among the Vethkai rested not on politics or diplomacy but on something far more powerful, on the memory of a woman who had stood in front of fire. On love, we have a saying on our worlds, Echo said. Whenever a cub asks why we protect rather than destroy, why we choose mercy over hunger, we tell them to remember the soft one who burned. Shadow stepped closer to James and lowered its massive head in a gesture of respect that the Vethkai reserve for only the most honored. Your species calls us predators, Shadow said, and we are. But we are also her children, shaped by her example, carrying her legacy across the stars. James looked at the statue one more time, and he saw not just Elena Vasquez, but all of humanity reflected in that carved face. All the stubborn refusal to accept death, all the willingness to burn for others, all the love that defined his species at its best. She would be proud, he said, of all of you. We know, Shadow said. She told us every day. The Vethkai of the capital raised their voices in a sound that echoed across the city. A sound that James's translator could not fully capture, but that he understood. Anyway, they were speaking her name, the name of a woman who had stood between orphaned predator cubs and fire, the name the jungle never forgot. Elena, and across 73 star systems, on every world where the Vethkai walked, her name echoed still.